Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Tonight we're in for a treat. Our esteemed guest, Dr. Aminah McBryde-Redzovic, is here tonight. She has her PhD in Community Health Sciences from the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health, and she is the lab coordinator for the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab. This is somebody who has a very decorated career, who has taught before, who has researched, who has helped organize conferences, has worked with the youth before. And it's exciting for me because I think a lot of the Muslim mental health professionals and people who are working on health, public health systems, we know each other from afar. And so I get to geek out and watch, Dr. Aminah do her thing today. So I'm going to go ahead and give her the floor. Thank you for being with us tonight. And inshallah, everyone benefits.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you to IMMH for the opportunity to present my research to you all. I'm honored and excited to be able to share the results of two of the papers included in my dissertation. And my dissertation looks at the impact of singlism on well-being for Muslim Americans, and we'll dive into what that means, what that looks like, and what are some of the differences that we see in experiences of singlism and mental well-being across gender and age specifically. So before I start, I'll begin with dua, inshallah. اللهم إني أسألك علما نافعا ورزقا طيبا وعملا متقبلا رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ربي زدني علما. So today we'll start with an introduction to singlism among Muslim Americans, and then we'll describe the results of each of these questions, and hopefully some time for discussion and question and answer. I really want to hear what you all think and what your experiences are, so I'm hoping that we could have a really rich discussion. So what is singlism, and what are the factors that impact someone's experience as a single person? Before we can define singlism, we need to be able to understand the context in which it exists. And so marriage has been seen as the global standard for what relationships look like, or what relationships should be for generations. And for many cultures, marriage is viewed as a life course milestone and a rite of passage into adulthood, meaning that in many societies, you are not considered a full functioning adult member of society until you reach that milestone, until you check that box. And research has found that being religiously affiliated, regardless of religious identity, but being religiously affiliated is associated with higher marriage rates, telling us that that religion puts a strong emphasis on marriage. But despite the fact that marriage has been the norm, we're witnessing a rise in singlehood, both globally and in the US, particularly over the last 40 years. And so we see that among this growing number of single people, women in particular, and especially older women, are more likely to be single. So what does singlehood look like for Muslim Americans? Muslim Americans have the highest rates of never married adults, meaning individuals who have never been in a formal marriage before, at 35% of the US Muslim population. This is compared to 23% of the general US population that has never been married. And when you look at other faith groups, you see that it's even lower at 12 to 19% of other faith groups who have never been married. We also see that 50% of Muslim Americans are currently married. So there's a little bit of a gap in the number of people who have been previously married but are not currently married. So that's why those numbers are not exactly adding up. And this 50% of Muslim Americans who are currently married is actually on par with other American faith groups, with the exception of evangelical Christians, who report 71% of their community being married. And then when you look at age, the Muslim American community is the youngest faith group in the US, and these are actually very recently updated numbers. These are based on ISPU's most recent report that was released, and their findings tell us that about 26% of the US Muslim population is between the ages of 18 and 24, and that's compared to only 10% of the general American population. And when you look at other religious groups and even non-religious groups, you see that their average for that age range is about 5 to 15%. So we have a much younger community than most other groups. And these percentages will become more meaningful when we start looking at the results and the findings for each of the papers. Now, context is needed to understand why singlism exists in the Muslim community. And I think most of this audience, all of this audience, I think, is Muslim. Um, and we know that according to Islam, in order to have any form of intimacy, it must be done within the confines of marriage. Marriage is seen in Islam, at the very least, as being a highly encouraged action, particularly for those who fear that they might end up engaging in some sort of non-marital intimacy or other forms of impermissible actions in this category. And beyond that, the often quoted hadith describing marriage as a means of religious devotion and is with the value of it being half of one's deen or half of one's faith. And finally, because physical relationships are supposed to only occur in the context of marriage, having children also must occur within that context. And this is important because in Islam, it is believed that there are only a few things that can continue to benefit you once you've passed away. Um, Sadaqah Jariyah, donating continuous charities, passing on beneficial knowledge, and having righteous children who can pray for you. And so, in order for a person to take advantage of that continued blessing of children who are praying for them, they must, again, in the context of Islam, be married and have children. Now, beyond the rules and regulations of the faith that justify why we see this favoring of marriage and this perpetuation of discrimination against single people in the Muslim community, there's a significant social and cultural value that's placed on marriage. Muslims are generally come from ethno-cultural collectivist communities. And what that means is that as a group, informed by the cultures of their homelands or their ethnicities, Muslims value communal interdependence. And what that means is that individuals are expected to support and rely on one another. That also means that we see familial duty as a primary responsibility for individuals. And so care and attention to the family is prioritized over individual wants and needs. Similarly, having a positive, sort of agreeable relationship with the broader community is seen as critical for the society to function. So, marriage from this viewpoint is seen as a social obligation and a rite of passage, like I mentioned earlier. And in this type of society, marriage serves the purpose of also securing and reinforcing the function and the growth of the social units, the family, the clan, or the tribe. It allows for these the web of society to expand and grow. Now, now that we have the understanding of the importance of marriage in Islam and the importance of marriage for Muslim Americans from both a religious and a cultural perspective, how does this translate to the experiences of single folks in the community? The response for not adhering to the social expectation of marriage is known as singlism, or the discrimination, stigma, and marginalization associated with being unmarried. It's important to emphasize that singlism can be experienced regardless of personal desire for marriage. So people who want to get married and who are seeking marriage experience singlism just like those who are not seeking or not interested in marriage. And in this way, singlism doesn't discriminate in who it targets. And in order for us to understand how singlehood, that identity marker, that badge that somebody might carry, how that singlehood is stigmatized and how singlism is experienced or perpetuated, we need to use some broad theoretical frameworks to understand this. So, what is stigma? To be stigmatized, according to the sociologist Irving Goffman, is to be discredited in society and to be viewed as tainted or spoiled as the result of failing to adhere to socially accepted norms. Now, Goffman goes on further to say that there are two kinds of stigma. There are visible stigmas and invisible stigmas. Visible stigmas are biases and discriminations against a characteristic that is, well, visible. So think something like a physical disability or skin color. Now, invisible or discredits a bull stigma are characteristics or parts of a person's identity that will only be associated with negative experiences if that characteristic is shared with other people, or if other people find out about that characteristic that you might hold. And research shows that invisible stigmas might actually be more harmful to a person's well-being because there's this added layer of fear around people finding out about this particular part of themselves. And then they also experience this decision fatigue around whether they feel safe to share with a particular individual or group of people. And so being single would be considered, in this context, an invisible stigmatized identity, especially in the Muslim community where markers of marriage, for example, wedding rings, are not always the norm. Um, so you can't, off face value, tell whether somebody is married or not. Now, singlism and other stigmas don't just exist on their own in a vacuum. Many people, especially those in the Muslim American community, given its diversity, hold multiple marginalized identities. So it's important to understand how those identities interact to impact a person's mental well-being. Now, intersectionality was a theory that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw to understand the ways in which experiences of gender and race-based discrimination impacted Black women. And this framework and this way of looking at things can help us understand the experiences of singlism within a very diverse Muslim community. And research shows us that having these multiple intersecting marginalized identities can actually also lead to worse well-being. And so in the context of singlism, those various identities that a person might hold, along with being single, might lead to different experiences of singlism depending on which kind of identities a person might hold. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the results. Now, I've described how mental health is affected by intersectional marginalization, but what are the effects of singlism specifically on well-being? According to existing research, experiencing singlism is linked to higher levels of loneliness, isolation, anxiety, depression, and other mental health conditions. Now, it's important to note that although there's a lot of literature out there that shows that, quote, being single is linked to these same conditions, when you talk to scholars of singlism specifically, they argue that it's in fact the experiences of singlism that these papers are capturing, that these studies are capturing, and it's not anything inherent to the identity of singlehood or being single itself. Meaning that at least according to these scholars, there's nothing inherently harmful about being single. It's the negative perceptions that people hold about singlehood and the subsequent mistreatment of single people that's actually linked to worse well-being. So the next thing to think about is why this topic is so important from a research perspective for the Muslim American community. As we've discussed before, Muslim Americans are an extremely religious group. They value marriage both from a religious perspective and a cultural perspective. And it's also a largely young and single population, which means that the experiences of singlism are likely to affect a larger proportion of the Muslim American community relative to other groups. And on top of that, Muslim Americans are seeing exponential growth with projected estimates showing that it should reach the second largest faith group in the US by 2040, meaning that the proportion of single Muslims is also likely going to expand. Now, the Muslim American community is extremely diverse, and that means that the social norms and expectations within the group are also very, very diverse. So if stigma is based on the accepted norms within the group, what is standard or what is supposed to happen for a particular person in a social group, the various ethnocultures that are represented in the Muslim American community can make navigating singlism and being single that much more complicated and challenging because you're interacting with so many different people from so many different perspectives and backgrounds. And there's also one more thing that makes the single Muslim American experience unique, and that's this tension between American culture, quote unquote, and their own ethnoculture and faith. And what I mean by that is that although singlism is present in the American society broadly, I would argue that it's not to the same extent, nor does it present in the same ways as it does in the Muslim society broadly, and specifically among Muslim Americans, because of that unique intersection of identity, faith, and culture. So what did we actually, what was our research and what did we conduct to understand this phenomenon? So for people to participate in the study, they had to be unmarried at the time of the study. They had to live in the US. They had to be a citizen or a green card holder or permanent resident. And the goal of that item in particular was to really capture the Muslim American experience versus people who have newly immigrated to the United States and have a much more, their cultural experiences are much more rooted to wherever they were coming from. And they also had to speak English, and then of course they had to identify as Muslim. So data was collected between April and October of 2024. We used convenient sampling, meaning that we just recruited through the community and through our networks within the community. The recruitment was done primarily through social media, WhatsApp, MSA groups, and then masjid listservs. I had a very comprehensive way of trying to search nationally to find organizations that could support this research. So I'm happy to talk about that later if anyone's interested. But the result was a final sample of 1,072 participants. So what did we actually look at? We aim to answer these three questions across the two papers that I'll talk about today. I do have a third paper that looks at qualitative data and interviews Muslim American women specifically, and it compares those actively seeking marriage versus those who are not. I didn't include that in today's presentation, but I'm happy to discuss it further if anyone's interested. So the three questions that we asked are, do rates of singlism differ across age and gender? And do they differ at the intersections of age and gender for Muslim Americans? Among unmarried Muslim Americans, are experiences of singlism associated with worse mental well-being? And then does religiosity moderate the relationship between that experience of perceived singlism and their mental well-being? So paper one specifically looked at those intersections of identity. So what we already know from existing literature is that Muslims tend to marry earlier than other faith groups. And we've already talked about how Muslims are both culturally and religiously collectivist and what that means for the importance of marriage. We also know that there are very clear gender-based expectations around marriage, according to existing literature. And research on singlism in other populations outside of the US talk about how the role age plays in experiences of singlism, and how even that is often gendered. Think the biological clock, for example, which is definitely seen as much more of a women's issue in society than it is a man's, although research is showing that it's actually something that both genders should consider. And as we've already discussed, there's no literature on this topic, particularly among Muslim Americans. And so it was really important to start building that base of research and analysis to understand this problem from a scientific perspective at a more systematic level. And so our hypotheses to answer this question were that we expected to see that men would report lower levels of singlism compared to women. We also expected that older adults would report higher levels of singlism compared to younger adults. And then at the intersection of gender and age, we expected that older women would report the highest levels of singlism compared with men of all ages and then younger women. And spoiler alert, they don't. In certain cases. So we'll talk about this. So this was a descriptive paper, which meant we calculated descriptive statistics and then ran a 3-model stepwise regression. The items that we used to measure singlism primarily came from the feelings of stigmatization of singles questionnaire, which with 6 additional questions that we added that particularly looked at Muslim-specific experiences or aspects of singlism. And then altogether, these questions fell into 6 primary buckets, which you can see on the screen. So interpersonal singlism and social judgment, restricted social connections, secretiveness and shame, defensiveness and fulfillment, and then faith-based singlism and familial singlism. And we used a mean score approach to create the subscales, and then we conducted a complete case analysis, which meant that every person who was included in this final sample for this particular study had to answer all of the questions that we included. The demographic variables that we collected included age, gender, and race ethnicity. And you can see those subcategories on the screen as well. So additionally, we collected information on people's education, employment, whether that person was previously married, whether they were born into Islam or converted to Islam, their marriage-seeking status, and whether they had a current or past non-marital romantic relationship. So the sample for this paper, when we took out folks who didn't respond to all of the questions, was 714. And so you see from the graph that it was a mostly female and mostly young sample. It was also mostly Asian, highly educated, with almost 90% holding at least an undergraduate degree. Most were employed, never married, born Muslim, and actively seeking marriage. And most had also not been in a non-marital romantic relationship in the past or were currently in a romantic relationship. So when we looked at average singlism scores, we saw that by far the highest scores were feelings of defensiveness around singlism, around singlehood, and a lack of fulfillment as a single person. So you see that in the dark brown color. And the lowest score was was in the yellow, and that measured our restricted social connection. And so what that meant was that um, it measured how much people felt like they lost friends or they didn't have connection to community as a result of being single. Whereas the highest category, the dark brown, measured when people experience somebody coming up to them and questioning them about their singlehood, do they feel like they need to get defensive in response to that? As well as whether they felt like they were fulfilled as a single human, as a single person. So to understand which demographic factors were significantly related to these different levels of singlism, we conducted the stepwise linear regression. So in line with our hypothesis, we found that men had lower levels of singlism overall than women, and those who were younger had lower levels than those who were older. Those are the first two yellow lines on the table. Now, looking at the individual subscales of singlism, we see that specifically women had higher levels of interpersonal singlism and social judgment. And they also reported higher levels of feelings of defensiveness and lack of fulfillment compared to men. That's that bottom yellow line. And we'll talk about why we might see those findings in a little bit more detail in a second. But when we looked at the intersection of gender and age, it was not significant, meaning that there were no differences in the levels of singlism between older men, older women, and younger women, except for one category. And that was the Muslim familial singlism category, or experiences of pressure from family, both parents and extended family, to marry. So this really looked at, do people find that they're experiencing pressure, or do they perceive that their family is pressuring them to find a partner, to get married, to go through the marriage seeking process? And the value that's highlighted in yellow on this table tells us that the level of familial singlism experienced by older men was significantly higher compared to younger men and both older and younger women, which was completely unexpected. And so we had to do a little bit more digging to understand why it was that we were seeing this finding. And we found something that was really interesting and very unexpected. And so when we sort of parsed out the categories of different demographics, we found that among young people, women have higher levels of singlism compared to men. But when we looked at the older group, we saw that men had much higher levels of singlism compared with women. And again, this was something that we did not expect at all to see. And so the next question that we asked was, well, why are we seeing these numbers? And why is the graph looking the way it is? And although answering these questions of why would require a lot more research, we came up with several hypotheses as to explain this phenomenon. In particular, this finding might highlight the multifaceted sort of socio-familial and gendered expectations that might be present in many Muslim American households. So what that looks like is women facing pressure to marry sooner because of this perceived fertility timeline, biological clock, while men experience later pressure because they're expected to establish themselves, particularly financially, before they can take on the responsibility of a marriage. Additionally, women might feel a sense of urgency due to this perception of a limited pool of potential partners. Because Muslim women are only supposed to marry Muslim men, the pool of potential options might be perceived as shrinking as women get older, because more and more Muslim men are getting married. In addition, Muslim men can also marry Christian and Jewish women, and so that shrinks the pool even further. Finally, and this is particularly present, I think, in South Asian cultures, but there's this expectation of sons, particularly the eldest son, and read that as their wives or the daughter-in-law, to serve as caretakers for aging parents. And so as parents age, they increase pressure on their oldest sons to find a partner so that they have that sort of built-in caretaker in their son and daughter-in-law. So Now that we've talked about familial singlism, let's take a step back and look at overall singlism and why might we be seeing differences by gender, specifically higher levels of interpersonal singlism and social judgment compared with men. My answer to that, or my hypothesis for why we see that, is gossip. Research shows that communal cultures tend to engage in gossip more than individualistic societies. Muslims, again, are both culturally and religiously collectivist. Um, Also, women tend to be more communal compared with men. Although men and women engage in similar amounts of gossip, the topics that women tend to gossip about are often focused more on social relationships than the gossip that men engage in. And this can be exacerbated further by the strong social divide that we see amongst Muslims. So women tend to spend more time just with other women, where and then there's very little mixing of genders in social environments. And so if women are mostly around other women, and women engage in gossip about social relationships often, then it's not unlikely that gossip may be a likely avenue for perpetuation of interpersonal singlism. And finally, when we look at the age-based singlism findings, I'm thinking that they're likely tied to expected life course timelines, with this idea that there's a cutoff in society after which people become quote unquote too old. I think there's an element of education that plays into this role, into this timeline rather. Um, and notably, although we don't see a lot of significant interactions between gender and age, I think age-based singlism is still flavored by gender. And we see this particularly in the qualitative data in that third paper that I didn't include today, but like I said, I'd be happy to talk about. So we'll keep moving forward onto paper 2, which looks at the role of religiosity in this equation. So we've established now that singlism is present among Muslim Americans. We know that it's here. We see it. The numbers prove it. And it affects Muslims differently depending on the different sort of identity markers that they might hold. So this paper in particular aims to establish whether singlism is considered a chronic stressor and whether that chronic stressor impacts well-being, and then the role that religiosity plays as a coping mechanism in particular. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go too in-depth on this theory, but this paper uses the minority stress theory as a framework for understanding singlism as a stressor. In particular, I wanted to note how this theory distinguishes between distal and proximal stress processes, which highlights that the experiences of singlism isn't just the moments of pressure from aunties in the masjid saying stuff to you, but it's a more complex experience that includes internalized negative perceptions of oneself, feeling like one needs to hide their singleness, or the broader social messaging that to be a full adult accepted in society or in the community, one must be married or have a partner. I also want us to note how other identity characteristics might have an influence on the way that these more immediate experiences of stress impact mental health outcomes. So there are 2 key dimensions of stress related to singlism that I focus on: psychological stress, or negative feelings tied to being single, and then social stress, which presents as social exclusion. It can present as social exclusion or social pressure. Before we get into the results, I want to define a few more terms, and that specifically I want to define coping and coping resources. So coping is how people respond to things that cause them stress. It can be positive, it can be negative. It depends. Coping resources are the tools that they use to engage in that coping mechanism. And religiosity can be seen as one of those tools. Within religiosity, there are 3 primary sort of sub-resources: social, or your religious community; personal, or your sort of religious knowledge, at least that's how I'm defining it; and then behavioral, or your spiritual practices. So think salah or dhikr or dua or something like this. Now, research shows that religiosity is the primary form of coping used amongst Muslims. In particular, spiritual connection, community engagement, and ritual worship, think again, salah or dua, are the main methods of coping that are engaged. So we wanted to understand whether singlism was actually associated with worse well-being. We didn't have any evidence although we talk about it in society, we didn't have any evidence, hard scientific evidence proving this. Um, or at least demonstrating it in a subsection of the Muslim community. And we also didn't know whether religiosity moderated that relationship between singlism and well-being. And we hypothesized that singlism would be associated with worse well-being just based on what we know about society and what we see in other communities. And we also anticipated that religiosity would in fact moderate that relationship, meaning that it would serve as a buffer or a protective factor against the negative impacts of singlism on well-being. So in this paper, we calculated some descriptive statistics. We ran a three-model stepwise regression, and then we added 4 additional models to the regression for the moderation analysis. We used questions again from the Feelings of Stigmatization questionnaire that I mentioned earlier and our Muslim-specific singlism questionnaire. We also added mental health continuum short-form questions, and we used the PHQ-2 and the GAD-2, which measure anxiety and depression. Our religiosity measures were drawn from the Psychological Measures of Islamic Religiosity scale, and we added some additional questions that weren't captured in that measure to understand the role of Islamic knowledge seeking in this relationship, as well as Muslim community engagement. Both of those elements were not captured in the Islamic religiosity scale, so we added those. Because we used a complete case analysis in this study as well, the sample was slightly smaller, but the demographics and the covariates were essentially the same. So it's a younger sample, it's mostly female, mostly Asian, highly educated, most had jobs, nearly all had never been married, etc. So when we looked at the findings, we saw that both well-being and singlism were roughly at or slightly above the midpoint of 2.5. When we measured these items, the scale was from 0 to 5. So 5 meaning you had exceptional well-being or exceptionally high singlism, and 0 meant you had really bad well-being or no singlism. So we see that it's about 2.5 or a little bit over 2.5, and about 3 for overall well-being. So not off the charts, but not crazy low either. The other areas of well-being that we measured were positive life functioning, psychosocial belonging. The societal worldview measured like how positively you view the current state of the world, and psychological distress is feeling down, feeling lonely, feeling upset, things like this. So when we looked at overall religiosity, which is out of 6, we see that the lowest scores were associated with seeking Islamic knowledge, meaning most people were not actively seeking Islamic knowledge in a formal way. And the highest was engagement in religious obligations, think salah, going to Jum'ah, things like that. So this is our sort of conceptual framework that we were working off of. And it basically demonstrates that we anticipate singlism impacting well-being and religiosity moderating that relationship or changing the level of that relationship. Some of the subtypes that you see here of religiosity that we mentioned, that we measured, the majority of them were statistically significant, meaning that they had a strong impact on that relationship. For the sake of time, we're only going to look at religious coping, but you can translate these findings to all of the other subscales. Now, religious coping specifically is defined as positive faith-based actions in response to life problems. So, for example, one of the questions that fit this subscale was, when I have a problem in life, to what extent do I consider it a test from Allah to deepen my belief in Him? So on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, participants had to rank to what extent they viewed these circumstances as a test. So what we see from the regression is that singlism is negatively correlated with well-being, that yellow box at the top, meaning that as singlism increases, well-being decreases. Now, when we added religious coping in model 4A, that yellow box at the bottom, we see that as religiosity increases, the negative effect of singlism on well-being decreased. Now, we needed to dig a little bit deeper to fully understand what those data were telling us. Just because we know this directional relationship doesn't mean we understood the details of it specifically. So we plotted the relationship, and what we found was that for those had very low, who reported very low or low levels of religious coping, well-being decreased significantly as singlism increased. So those top two lines on the graph, the like teal, blue, and the orange. I'm sorry, the navy and the red. For those with moderate levels of religious coping, that green line in the middle, the change in well-being as singlism increased was not significant. And similarly, for those with high and very high levels of religious coping, the change in well-being as singlism increased was also not significant, but the direction of those lines suggests that there's a trend of growth and adaptation as singlism increases, which means that religiosity, you can interpret that as religiosity potentially being a buffer to the experiences of singlism. And the more religious you are, or the more you engage in religious coping, I should say, the better your outcomes are from a well-being perspective. And we see this similar pattern across all of the significant moderations. This graph, when we generated it for all of those subscales that we talked about, just all of these subscales, that graph looked almost identical for all of them. So it had this exact same pattern. So what does this mean? What do these findings mean? And why might we be seeing this consistent pattern across different forms and levels of religiosity? First, we saw that religious coping, community engagement, and low negative reappraisal were all positively associated with well-being, and this aligns with existing literature on religiosity and well-being. There's a lot of work that has been done to study how religiosity is used as a coping mechanism, and in its relationship with well-being. Additionally, we see that religious coping, community engagement, performing encourage Islamic actions, think being kind to your neighbors or treating your parents with respect, things like this. And engagement in obligatory worship buffered the negative impact of singlism on well-being. And we can draw on the Islamic spiritual tradition to provide potential explanations for why or how we might be seeing this. And I've identified five of these elements of the tradition that might explain why. So first is the belief in qadr, or the belief that God has complete knowledge and power over all things. And this belief can offer ease and comfort for people navigating stressful situations, especially when it feels like it's out of their control. Second is nasib, or the understanding that your sort of allotment in life, or what's meant for you, is already decided. So what is meant for you will not pass you perspective. And as Muslims will often quote the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ about tying your camel and trusting in Allah, meaning you do your part and then you leave the rest to God. The third is Dr. Umar Suleiman said, romance might not be your risk. We saw the response to this viral clip, I think it was Ramadan 2023. It went viral because it resonated with a lot of people. And it's this idea that accepting the idea that marriage may not be a part of the blessings that Allah decreed for you can be liberating, and it helps people shift their focus onto the other blessings that Allah might have bestowed upon them. And the fourth is the nature of ibtila, or trials and tests. The Quran talks extensively about this, about how God will test people with challenges and circumstances and situations so that they can practice patience and so that they can strengthen their relationship with Him. The Quran is very clear as well that even when Allah tests a person, He's never going to give them something that they can't handle. And so for single people, the struggles associated with singlism and that negative perception of them being single can be reframed as a form of ibtila, and understood as being from God and not impossible to bear. Finally, belief in the power of dua, as is our final pathway through which single Muslims may cope with singlism, using religiosity as this idea that in Islam there's an understanding that no prayer ever goes unanswered. Whether you're praying for a partner or have marriage-related pressures from family, whether you're praying for a partner or praying to have the marriage-related pressures from family removed, it's knowing that God has heard that and will always respond to that. And that knowledge and that awareness can offer incredible comfort to people navigating these very challenging situations. And so taken together, these five elements of faith highlight that relinquishing of power and responsibility for circumstances or situations to God can help single Muslims cope with these experiences of singlism. So these two studies were not without limitations. As a cross-sectional study, meaning we only captured data at one point in time, we don't know what the longitudinal effects or the long-term effects of singlism are on well-being. And because we used convenience sampling, meaning we just gathered participants from the networks that I had access to, that limits how generalizable we can say these findings are, how widespread these findings might be truly in the Muslim community. And we also can't establish any causality in terms of certain things causing singlism or singlism causing mental distress. And these data also might be subject to recall and social desirability bias, which means that people might forget or misunderstand their experiences as they reflect back on them. And they might also respond to questions in a way that they're interpreting the questions as, or they're trying to give answers that they think we want versus what their actual experiences are. So future research should have a more nuanced look at the intersectional approaches that I examined. So looking at more detailed age categories, focusing on differences across race ethnic groups, for example, or looking at differences between different sects of Muslims. We also need to do some interventional research to improve well-being outcomes, developing programs and resources for single community members. And then lastly, we need longitudinal work. We need to understand the experiences of singlism over time and how coping with that experience might change over time. So overall, we know from this dissertation that singlism is real amongst Muslim Americans. We now have concrete established evidence that Muslim Americans are reporting a certain level of singlism. We know that within the Muslim community, singlism impacts men and women differently. We also know that it impacts young and old differently. And at the intersection of gender and age, younger women and older men have it the worst compared to the other categories. We know that singlism is harmful to well-being. We've established that now as there's concrete evidence for that. We know that family can play a critical role in the perpetuation of singlism. And we know that religiosity can help buffer that experience. But with all of that said, much more Muslim American specific research is needed to be able to really truly have a strong grasp on this topic, and to be able to develop evidence-based interventions that are rooted in research, that are rooted in the realities of this situation, to help improve outcomes for Muslim Americans who are single. And that is my findings. Thank you all so much. I hope you found it interesting. Please stay in touch. There are I'm on various platforms. If you're interested in some of the research that I accessed for my literature review, you can scan that QR code. There's a bibliography by chapter there. I will also say that my dissertation is in progress in terms of publication. I'm hoping to get those papers out in formal academic journals. And if you're familiar with that process, you know that it just takes a lot of time. So I'm hoping, inshallah, that they will be out very soon, but happy to talk through some of those findings. I'm also sharing some of the findings in snippets on my social media accounts. So. Dr. Zane, I can't hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you very much. And if we can get a round of applause and duas for Dr. Aminah for being here tonight. And we do have time. So if you want to field questions, you can. If you want to leave it and people can follow up afterwards, they can. I'll leave it up to your discretion. But yeah.
Yeah, no, alhamdulillah, I'm happy to answer questions or just have a discussion. I'd really like to know what people's thoughts are, what their experiences are.
We have Mira. So yeah, Mira, go for it.
Unmute. Okay, thanks. Assalamu alaikum. I'm excited to be here. I don't know if you remember, I met you at the Muslim Mental Health Conference that was in Detroit in April.
Yes. Yes.
And so I was really excited when I saw this, and I met you too, Dr. Zane. But my background, for those of you who don't know, I'm a psych mental health nurse practitioner, and I also do kind of like coaching on the side, relationship coaching for single Muslim women, and it's kind of evolved into relationship coaching for married women as well. But I was just really, really interested in how much, or maybe collaborating, how much you've kind of looked at, like, what are the influences on, because I mean, I can kind of tell you from my experiences, like what people have told me, but what are the reasons that are making it harder for people to get married? Because it seems like a lot of it is, if you look at family, people are like, I don't want to have a relationship like my parents. A lot of, like, attachment issues. I'm sure, working in mental health, you know these things. So how can we kind of look at what those underlying factors are? Because there is obviously some component of, you can do all the work in the world, and if Allah doesn't have it decreed for you to get married, you're not going to get married, and that's that. However, for the things that people can control, what are the things that you see as like being actionable things that, like, mental health providers, coaches, people doing this work in the community can actually do to try to help people work through those things that are preventing them, and then also strengthen their mental health in the process?
That's a really great question. I think that the first thing from a community perspective is um, we need to make the process easier. I think that we've allowed culture and um, other social expectations or standards that are not from the Islamic framework to sort of integrate into the process that we've established for people to get married. And so it makes it really difficult for people to navigate and try to find somebody. I think that, there's a lot of bias and discrimination in that process that for people who are marginalized within the Muslim community often have to navigate that on top of everything else. So that makes it that much more challenging. So I think we need to again make it easier, make the process more simple. We need to check our own biases when it comes to as a community to help people find matches that are not rooted in culture or biases, racism. And I think that we also, for a lot of people, we're losing the traditional community in the sense that, we're in a community that we can tap into to ask. And so creating spaces that revitalize that community energy and that space to just get to know people. We're all so busy with everything that's going on in our lives, and we don't have an opportunity to just connect with people and get to know people. And I think that's how those opportunities are created, how they arise. So yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I can definitely say that what you said about, like, making it harder for people, like, or sometimes families or like societies making it harder, I think that's definitely true, because my background is, I'm Palestinian, and I've heard some people say that, Palestinian women say, well, their parents will only let them marry someone who's from their same village, to that extreme. Like,
Yep.
or people saying that, like parents saying that they would never accept a man who's divorced for their daughter, or, vice versa, things like that. So I think that also makes a difference. And then when you look at, because I work a lot with women who are divorced as well, the difficulties in people saying, well, this person has kids, so I don't want to divorce some, I don't want to marry someone who's divorced with kids. Or people saying that, like you said, the racism exists, and saying that their parents wouldn't accept for them to marry. And I guess my approach is asking people, okay, what are the values that you're looking for in terms of a partner, not just how much money do they make, what do they do for a living, what's their educational level, and those things. But
Yeah.
I still think it's also hard when people live in areas where they don't, like, their families don't know people, or they live in an area where it's isolated because there's not much of a Muslim community. That's where I grew up, in a small town in Tennessee. There weren't, a lot of people. So it was kind of like one of those things where it happened. But alhamdulillah, I think those are
I think we
definitely
as a community,
challenges.
yeah, I think we as a community need to create those resources for people. We're in a digital age. We can create the resources for people in that situation where they don't have the opportunity to connect to a broader Muslim community. And I think we just need to return to like a prophetic community model. If
Absolutely.
we look at the prophets' marriages, they were all to people who, in today's society, we would shun or we wouldn't consider as marriageable options.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah.
I think,
I,
and this is the last thing I'll kind of say, is I think that's a challenge, because I have seen people try to be matchmakers, but then they present someone to another person and they just like look at their picture and they're like, I don't like the way they look, and then give them a chance. So we have a long way to go as a community, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I had if it's okay, I had a comment and a question.
Yeah.
So I think this conversation that you're having right now, the two of you, is reminding me about how a lot of the sort of like emotional clothing that we put on in our communities is the thing that gets in the way. And I really appreciate that your study kind of highlighted this. It's not singlism itself, it's the perceptions of and the treatment of people. Because I think when people say, I want somebody to marry somebody from our own culture, I want to marry somebody that's this tall, or I want to marry somebody who's not divorced, they're implying what those things mean, and they're implying what the impact of those things are, right?
Mhm,
And so it's like,
mhm.
if I have these things, then I'll be happy. And there's no guarantee of that. There's so many people who project on each other within the same village because we see ourselves in other people who are similar to us. And so I really like this way of thinking, because a lot of times the reason is not Islam, but people will conflate, and say, well, oh, it's just going to be easier if you're the same. I'm like, is that what you really think? Have you actually reflected about it? Or is this
Yeah,
just some sort of like stencil reasoning you heard, picked up, internalized, and are now repeating? Right.
yeah, exactly.
But when you encounter that, Dr. Amina, like this stuff, like the perceptions on people, these we like narrative therapy, people say these thin scripts about how we should live our lives. Um, what are your suggestions? And I know it's probably a big question. What is one way we can liberate ourselves from that, and or confront or challenge people who speak to single people with those thin scripts? Is my
The
question.
dean, the dean. Um, you're right. It's a big question. There's a lot of layers to that, but I think the simple answer is learning our deen, learning what the religion has to say, learning the history of the generations who have come before us, and recognizing ourselves in those characters, in those individuals, um, because those labels that people put on us, or those um, negative assumptions that are made about us, um, there's always an example from the Sirah, from the stories of the prophets, that we can relate to. And I think learning how they approached it, how they responded to it, how they navigated their emotional pain and challenge society's expectations, can give us a blueprint for how we can respond. In my interviews with in the third paper, the qualitative paper, um, so many women talked about how that was increasing their Islamic knowledge was like a saving grace for them in navigating those experiences, um, particularly with family and close community members, where they're being approached and saying, to the example that was made earlier about, well, you have to marry somebody from our village and this, that, and the other thing. When they bring the prophet, when they bring the examples of the prophet, or they bring, history from Islam, it's very hard to argue with that. Um, and so that was something that they found to be empowering for themselves in navigating this experience of singlism within the community.
I want to thank you for your time. So one more round of applause for Dr. Amina. I thank you for being here tonight. And inshallah, for those who are here and those who are maybe watching our video recording of this, inshallah, may everyone benefit. And come back anytime, Dr. Aminah. We would love to have you for a future webinar as well.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.